among the various themes that I've chosen for different presentations, this seemed like a fairly obvious one because there are so many women who are honored on medals. So this is the overall title. And we begin at the beginning. And I can't begin at the beginning without referencing perhaps one of the greatest medalists of all time, and certainly, or arguably, I should say, the inventor of the medal as we know it. There were some predecessors, but this was really the beginning. And this is the medal of Cecilia Gonzaga. He's Pisanello. The thing about Pisanello is that consistently with his imagery, he must have been, either he had very good advisors, maybe court humanists, or perhaps the commissioner herself or himself, or he himself was relatively learned and in any case had an extraordinary imagination. And Cecilia was known for her beauty and for her intellectual accomplishments, and also for her chastity. So in those days, of course, marriages were arranged, and her father wanted her to marry, I think it was a Malatesta, a young Malatesta, and she refused because she wanted to go into a convent. She wanted to become a religious. And her father, of course, was irate. And in those days, you just didn't argue with those kinds of orders. So she turned to her mentor, who was the teacher of the Gonzaga children, Vittorino da Feltre, for whom there is also a medal by Pisanello, and sought his help. And he interceded for her with her father, and persuaded him that her choice was she needed to adhere to her choice. So the reverse illustrates this in a very clever way. As you know, the legend of the unicorn is that he can only be subdued by a virgin. And so she is represented here having subdued the unicorn, which is actually derived from a drawing by Pisanello of a goat, which is kind of an ironic combination. So there's a basic Christian direction to this iconography, but it's the early Renaissance, and also the classics and the ancient world are of great importance. And so he has very, very subtly put a crescent moon in the sky. And of course, he's referring there to Diana. So he is referencing a virgin twice over. This is also, I thought, a very representative and beautiful and quite famous medal of a woman in the early Renaissance. This is Isotta degli Atti, who was the mistress, again, of another Malatesta, perhaps the most famous Malatesta, Sigismondo Malatesta. He was, I guess, in his teens, and he was on his way. He was a condottiere, or a mercenary soldier, and he was on his way to an assignment. And he stopped in a town where he saw this 10-year-old girl, and she was 10 years old. He was in his teens, I think, and fell in love with her. And a few years later, she became his mistress, still very young. He was married 3 times, but she was really the love of his life, and eventually he did marry her. On the reverse is the Malatesta elephant, which has many meanings. In her case, it probably also, although not quite as accurately as for Cecilia, references chastity, but it's also strength, and it's the heraldic emblem of the Malatestas. So it also references his strength. Moving on, and I'll try and go as quickly as possible. two monarchs. This wonderful portrait of Mary Tudor, which is based on a painting by Antonis More, and was done for her marriage with Philip II of Spain, which was not perhaps the happiest of marriages. Earlier, there is this medal of Anne, Duchess of Brittany, who was married several times and was a very powerful monarch. And these were done on the obverse. This is the reverse, and on the obverse is the portrait of one of her husbands, Louis XII. And this was done by the city of Lyon, and you see the lion on the bottom, for their visit to the city. This is a very rare and quite extraordinary gold medal of Marie de Medici, another queen, in this case, the Queen of France, and a very controversial history. She was the wife of Henry IV, and then became regent after he was assassinated in 1610, I think. And most of Dupray's medals are signed. This one is not signed, and I have a feeling that it was probably a trial that was never actually produced, because there's one other in bronze in a private collection, and a cliché, a kind of uniface, hollow example in the Bibliothèque Nationale. But she had a very controversial and rocky reign as Queen Regent, and eventually was tossed out and ended up dying in poverty in a German city. Of course, we can't talk about queens without Marie Antoinette. And in this case, a very tragic history. And this is, so when she was guillotined, of course, after her husband, Louis XVI, who was guillotined in January of that year, 1793. The reaction throughout the monarchies of Europe was extreme. And so this is a German medal which shows her on the obverse, and then she is being taken off to the Place, now the Place de la Concorde, where there is the guillotine. And she is shown in a tumbrel here, which is where the way those who are going to be guillotined were brought to the guillotine. And this is probably based on a very famous drawing that was done by Jacques-Louis David. He was at a window overlooking her route, and he saw her and sketched her in the tumbrel. She died a very dignified death. And of course, if we are talking about monarchs, this is a kind of reconstructed portrait of Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's first wife, by David d'Angers, quite large and copper gilt. And finally, this gold medal that was struck for her Diamond Jubilee or 60th year of reign, with her portrait when she first took the throne. Talking about roti, this I think is a very personal and quite lovely portrait of his wife. And he says, "My dearest wife, I have fixed your face in brass so that I shall have you ever before my eyes, ever young and happy." This has always been one of my favorite medals. As an expression of motherhood, it's a particularly effective, I think, image. And I've shown this before. Anne of Austria was the wife of Louis XIII. And for 20 years, they attempted to produce an heir, which they finally did. She had made a vow that she would build a monastery or convent if she had a son. And somehow somebody was listening up there, and she did become pregnant, and she gave birth to perhaps one of the most famous and most powerful kings of France, or maybe of any monarchs, Louis XIV. And Jean Rorin has shown them here in a combination of a sort of official profile portrait, but also then made it extremely intimate and very much a kind of narrative, where the young Louis, who was about 7 years old here, is playing with the tassels on his mother's gown, and she's gently holding him. And there is a kind of extra level of narrative here, of emotion, which has made this medal, I think, always one of my favorites. And this is the facade of the Val de Grace. This was not the facade of the church as it was finally constructed, but it's also perhaps one of the most striking and beautiful architectural reverses on any medal. And this is another representation of motherhood with Victoria Louise, who was the Duchess of Brunswick-Lüneburg and a part of the, by marriage, part of the British royal family. And this is the celebrating the birth of her second son with her first son here, and kind of, again, a very tender and I think quite moving narrative. And then I thought, for children with women, or let's say female children, that these were quite lovely works, again by 19th century French artists, where the revival of the medal in the hands of a number of very significant artists was extremely important. So you see here little Marthe Cécile, and then here Jacqueline Chéry, just as examples of this subject. In this case, this medal is celebrating the 100-year-old birthday of Cornelia Behrens. She is saying that I have completed a century and wait for salvation. Or this also celebration of a death in a Dutch medal with the typical fabrication of two hollow shells that are soldered together, the coat of arms and the arms of the families related to her. This is Gertrude Hoffmann, and again, represents finally death. And celebrating, of course, beauty in two very different versions of beauty. One, a 17th century woman who was rather notorious. She was the mistress of a nobleman and apparently arranged for her husband's murder so that she could marry her lover. Whereas on the other hand, this 19th century is very quite beautiful relief by Chapelain, one of the leading of the French artists of the 19th century. Or what to make of these. Here is Elizabeth, Duchess of Brunswick-Kahlenberg. I'm not quite sure that when this was put together, it was submitted to her for approval. Somehow, looking at the medal, I doubt it, but it's a rather curious piece. Or this bourgeois lady on the reverse of her husband's portrait with this extraordinary headgear. And this is Elizabeth in a woodcut. And there are paintings of her also, but nothing that really looks like this. I'm not quite sure how they arrived at that. And then fame, Catherine de Bourbon, who was part of the French royal family, very well known for her poetry, and with this lovely representation of the three graces. And Isabella Adriani, who was a very famous actress and who is shown here. The question is, for whom were medals made, and who commissioned them, and why were they given? And the range of subjects is really quite broad. In this case, celebrating a very famous actress. And here, an artist who has become very well known because her works have been sort of revived. Her whole story has been revived, and she has received a great deal of attention. Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a leading painter, a painter who was extremely successful and worked for royalty in an age when women did not have an easy time achieving those kinds of levels in that sort of profession. Although there were several other Italian women artists who were equally as adroit and equally as famous. Or this woman who was a physicist and was celebrated for her accomplishments, one of the very few women who received a doctorate at that time, and who achieved great fame, again, in a profession that was really almost entirely dominated by men. And going back to the French Revolution, Madame Roland, who would have been perhaps one of the most critical, one of the most severe critics of Marie Antoinette, but who ended up also under the guillotine because she was on the wrong side of the political fence. She was a Girondiste, and they were almost all murdered by the Jacobins or under the leadership of Robespierre. And this is another celebration of an actress, Marie Laurent. The reverse shows on the border some of the roles for which she was famous, and in the field, an inscription of homage to her accomplishments. And then finally, even a Viennese laundress merited a medal. I suppose that it's certainly something that one does merit if you're a successful laundress. But this is more a kind of work of art, and perhaps also celebrating the beauty of a young woman. That's it.